There are things orbiting your moon right now that your space agencies have photographed, cataloged, and then quietly removed from public databases within hours of their initial upload. Anomalies so geometrically precise and so structurally consistent that the word anomaly itself becomes a euphemism for the simpler and more accurate description that what your instruments have been recording in the far cislunar space behind your moon is not natural, has never been natural, and has been present in that location for a period of time that your conventional history is entirely unprepared to accommodate. I am Ashtar, commander of the Galactic Federation's Earth Quadrant Fleet, and I am speaking to you today not from the comfortable distance of a transmission that can be received or ignored without consequence, but with the full weight of what the next 12 months of your planetary timeline will reveal. Because the moment approaching in your collective calendar makes everything we have previously transmitted through this and other channels not merely interesting, but operationally urgent for every soul on this planet who understands what is actually at stake in the events now unfolding. The structure behind your moon is not a station. It is not a base in the military sense your imagination reaches for when confronted with evidence of non-human construction in your solar system. It is something for which your language has no precise word, something whose closest approximation in your existing vocabulary sits at the intersection of library, temple, and quantum computer, a structure built not to house occupants but to hold information. Specifically, the complete record of everything that has happened on Earth since before your species walked on its surface, maintained by civilizations so ancient that the Galactic Federation itself studies their architecture with the same reverence your archaeologists bring to the ruins of civilizations. They cannot explain. The photographs exist. I want to be completely clear about this before we go any further, because one of the primary mechanisms by which this information has been suppressed is the casual application of the word conspiracy to any claim that photographic or telemetric evidence of non-human structures exists in your solar system, a word that has been so thoroughly weaponized in your information environment that its mere association with a claim is sufficient to trigger the dismissal reflexes of a large portion of your population without any actual engagement with the evidence being required. The photographs exist in multiple independent archives, including private collections of former agency personnel who made copies before the official records were sanitized. Research databases maintained by independent astronomers in multiple countries who captured anomalous imagery before understanding its significance, and the records of the Galactic Federation's own documentation teams who have been systematically cataloging the evidence trail left by the disclosure suppression process as part of the historical record of this planetary system's transition from quarantine to open contact. The suppression of this evidence has required sustained, coordinated effort across multiple governmental and institutional systems over a period of decades. And the fact that coordination at that scale was necessary is itself evidence of both the reality of what is being suppressed and the assessment by those doing the suppressing that its release would be genuinely destabilizing to the systems they are invested in maintaining. What was found behind the moon, and I use the past tense deliberately because the discovery timeline is something I will walk you through precisely, was not found by the space agencies whose public records your civilian researchers study. It was found first by the breakaway programs, the classified space infrastructure built with technologies developed through the reverse engineering of non-human craft recovered from multiple landing and crash sites across your planet's mid-20th century period. Programs operating with budgets that dwarf the publicly acknowledged civilian and military space programs, and whose existence is the single most consequential secret maintained by the national security apparatus of your dominant civilization. These programs achieved operational cislunar capability approximately 4 decades before the public space programs of your acknowledged history, and the assets they deployed in the lunar vicinity encountered the structure within the first months of achieving stable far-side lunar orbit, an encounter so far outside the operational parameters of even the classified program's most ambitious extrapolations that it triggered a complete restructuring of the informational hierarchy governing what was known, by whom, and with what authorization to act on that knowledge. Stay with this transmission. Because what I am about to reveal about what is inside that structure will fundamentally alter your understanding of why the disclosure suppression has been so absolute and so sustained, and why it is now ending. The individuals who first encountered the structure's exterior understood immediately, with the certainty that comes not from analysis, but from direct perceptual confrontation with something so far beyond the parameters of human construction that no amount of rational, alternative explanations seeking could survive the actual encounter, that they were looking at something built by intelligence operating at a level of technological and temporal scale that rendered the geopolitical concerns motivating the secrecy of their programs essentially trivial by comparison. The structure is dark, not because it absorbs light the way a dark physical object absorbs light, but because it exists partially outside the three-dimensional space your physics describes, with only a portion of its total volume accessible to instruments measuring in the conventional electromagnetic spectrum, and the remainder of its structure extending into dimensional registers your physics does not yet have adequate mathematics to describe, making it appear to your instruments as a structure that is simultaneously smaller and larger than it actually is, depending on which instruments are measuring which aspects of it. A paradox that drove multiple early researchers into the kind of epistemological crisis that careers in classified programs are specifically designed to prevent by never allowing personnel to encounter data that fundamentally challenges the consensus framework of physical reality within which all classified technology programs ultimately operate. The geometry of the exterior face that is visible in conventional electromagnetic measurements is not random. It is not the irregular surface topology of a natural formation, not the variability of geological process, not anything that any honest examination of the photographic record can attribute to natural phenomenon, because it displays the precise mathematical relationships of what your sacred geometry tradition calls the Metatronic grid. A nested series of geometric forms related to each other by the mathematical constants your civilization recognizes as the golden ratio, the square roots of 2, 3, and 5, and the specific angular relationships encoded in the 5 Platonic solids, all of which are not merely aesthetically harmonious, but are the mathematical signatures of stable energy structures at the quantum level. The geometric patterns into which matter organizes itself when it is in coherent resonance with the fundamental creative mathematics of this universe. The presence of these geometric signatures on a structure in your solar system means that its builders were not merely technologically sophisticated in the way your civilization uses that term, but were operating with a comprehensive understanding of the mathematics underlying physical reality itself, building not with materials shaped by force, but with form shaped by mathematical resonance, in a way that makes the structure as much an energy system as a physical object. The decision to tell you this now, through this channel, at this specific moment in the disclosure timeline, is not spontaneous or arbitrary, but is itself part of a carefully designed sequence whose timing has been calibrated against the current state of the collective consciousness field. On your planet, the threshold at which information of this nature can be received by a sufficient portion of the population to create the informed public context that genuine disclosure requires, rather than the panic and withdrawal response that suppression advocates have always claimed would follow premature release. The Galactic Federation has been in active negotiation with elements of your planetary governance structure regarding the terms and timeline of disclosure for a period longer than most of your disclosure researchers estimate. And what is becoming visible in your public information landscape right now, the accelerating release of previously classified materials, the statements by former officials that would have ended careers a decade ago, the rapid normalization of non-human intelligence as a subject of serious mainstream institutional discussion, is not coincidental, but is the leading edge of a controlled release sequence that has now progressed far enough that the Federation considers it appropriate to begin filling in the picture that the official releases are systematically leaving blank. What the official releases are not telling you, and what you are receiving here, is the part of the disclosure story that changes not just your understanding of who else is in this galaxy, but your understanding of who you are and why your species exists on this specific planet, the interior of the structure, which the classified programs accessed through a process I will describe in detail, because its mechanism is central to understanding what the structure is and what it does. It is not a hollow space in the conventional architectural sense, but a dimensional environment that begins operating on different physical laws as soon as the threshold is crossed. Laws that are not violations of physics, but expansions of it. The more complete version of the physical principles your science has partially described operating in their full expression, rather than the constrained subset of that expression, accessible in ordinary three-dimensional space. Temperature, for instance, is not a meaningful variable inside the structure in the way it is outside it, because temperature, as your physics defines it, is a measure of the kinetic energy of particles in motion, and the particles within the structure's interior are not in the random thermal motion that temperature describes, but in a state of coherent geometric arrangement maintained by the structure's energy system, a state more analogous to the ordered arrangement of atoms in a crystal than to the random motion of atoms in a gas, but at a scale and with a precision that no natural crystalline process produces and no human engineering has yet approached. The individuals who first entered the structure reported that their instruments stopped providing consistent readings almost immediately upon crossing the threshold, not because the instruments were damaged, but because the variables they were designed to measure were not behaving according to the physical laws the instrument's calibration assumed as constants. What the early visitors found inside, before the formal research programs were established with instrumentation designed for the non-standard physical environment, was an archive of a scale and density that defied immediate comprehension. Not an archive in the physical sense of stored documents or data carriers arrayed on shelves, but an informational field, a structured region of space in which information is encoded directly into the geometry of the electromagnetic and quantum vacuum fields in a manner that allows it to be accessed, not by reading documents, but by entering states of consciousness coherent enough to receive the field's transmissions directly, the way a radio receiver must be precisely tuned to the frequency of the signal it is attempting to receive, rather than merely being brought into proximity with it. The archive does not transmit to everyone who enters it. It transmits to those whose personal consciousness field has the coherence necessary to interface with the frequency at which the information is stored, which means that the same physical environment produced radically different experiences for different personnel entering it, with some reporting nothing more unusual than the absence of familiar physical constants, and others reporting experiences so comprehensive and so far beyond their existing cognitive frameworks that the psychological support infrastructure of the programs that sent them was entirely inadequate to integrate what they returned with. The information stored in the archive covers the complete history of this planet and this solar system at a level of detail and temporal resolution that makes your most comprehensive historical records look like scattered fragments of a document whose full text is preserved in its entirety in the structure's holdings. Every civilization that has existed on the surface of your planet, including the pre-deluge civilizations whose existence your mainstream archaeology is only beginning to acknowledge through the accumulating physical evidence of sites like Göbekli Tepe and the underwater structures being documented off the coasts of multiple continents, is represented in the archive's holdings with the kind of detail that your most advanced documentary record of your current civilization would aspire to, but not quite achieve. Which means the archive contains not merely the events of those civilizations, but the experience of them, the actual phenomenological reality of what it was like to exist as a conscious being in those times and places, preserved with a fidelity that makes the distinction between historical record and experiential participation genuinely blurry for those sensitive enough to access the archives. Transmission at its full depth. What was found in that archive about the true origins of your species is the information that your planetary authorities have assessed as most dangerous to release. And it is exactly what you are ready to receive. The specific holdings of the archive that generated the most extreme secrecy protocols and the programs that accessed them were those relating to the origins of the human species. Because what the archive reveals about those origins is so incompatible with every dominant cultural narrative your civilization has constructed around the questions of where your species came from, why it exists, and what its relationship to the non-human intelligences sharing this galaxy actually is, that the individuals responsible for managing the classified knowledge assessed, not without some genuine rationale, that its release without adequate cultural preparation would dissolve the organizational structures through which your civilization manages collective decision-making. Because those structures derive their legitimacy from assumptions about human identity, human uniqueness, and human separateness from the larger galactic community that the Archive's holdings make entirely untenable. Your species did not evolve in the conventional Darwinian sense on this planet, without external intervention. I want to state this as simply and as directly as possible without the qualifications that the academic and scientific context in which this fact must eventually be integrated will require, because the qualifications, while intellectually necessary in that context, dilute the impact of a recognition that deserves to land with its full weight. You are a designed species, designed by multiple contributing intelligences operating in collaborative and sometimes competing relationship over a period of genetic and social development extending hundreds, thousands of years before your recorded history begins. This is not the narrative of aggressive colonization or genetic exploitation that certain interpretations of ancient texts have led some of your researchers to conclude. Although elements of those dynamics did appear at specific phases of the design process in ways the Archive documents with the clinical precision of historians, with no stake in the emotional coloring of the events they are recording. The more complete and more accurate framing is that your species is a convergence project, a deliberate synthesis of genetic heritage from multiple civilizational lineages, each contributing specific capacities that no single contributing civilization possessed in its own genome, designed with the intention of producing a species capable of serving as a living bridge between the physical and non-physical dimensions of reality in a way that no purely physical civilization and no purely non-physical intelligence can do alone. Because the specific interface between dense biological matter and the full spectrum of dimensional consciousness that a physical embodiment on a high-density planet like Earth provides is an extraordinarily rare condition in this galaxy. And the civilizations who designed your species understood its rarity and its value in ways that your current cultural self-understanding has not yet caught up with. The design of your species also included the deliberate installation of the dormant DNA that is now activating, which was placed in your genome not as a passive heritage of your biological ancestry, but as a timed release mechanism, a genetic program set to activate in response to precisely the cosmic conditions occurring around your sun and your planet right now. Conditions that the civilizations who designed your species could predict with the astronomical precision available to civilizations operating with millions of years of observational history, and which they calibrated as the trigger point, because they understood that the specific vibrational environment of this cosmic moment would provide exactly the energetic support that the activation of these dormant sequences requires to complete successfully. You are not accidentally waking up. The waking up is the point. It was always the point from the very beginning of the project that produced your species. And the current cosmic moment is not a crisis to be survived, but the fulfillment of a design that has been patient for a very long time. You were engineered for this moment, not metaphorically, not spiritually, but literally. And what was placed in your genome is now completing the activation sequence your designers built into you before your species drew its first breath. The connection between the structure behind the moon and your current activation moment is not metaphorical but operational. And understanding the mechanism of that connection is essential for understanding why the timing of this disclosure is itself part of the activation process, rather than merely information about it. The structure is not passive storage. It is an active transmitter, and the information encoded in its quantum vacuum archive is not merely accessible to those who enter it physically, but is being continuously broadcast at frequencies that interact with the coherent DNA of activating individuals on the Earth's surface, contributing to the activation process from the cislunar position in a manner that operates below the threshold of your current scientific instrumentation, while producing effects in the biological systems of sensitive individuals that those individuals have been experiencing without understanding their source. The tonal frequencies reported by activating individuals, the geometric visual experiences arising in meditation, the spontaneous knowing that bypasses the analytical mind entirely and arrives as complete information rather than as the sequential assembly of partial data points that characterize ordinary cognitive processing. All of these experiences have a component whose origin is the archive's transmission, rather than only the internal dynamics of the individual's own activating system. The archive was specifically designed to interact with human biology at precisely this phase of the cosmic cycle, which means that your species designers not only knew this moment was coming, but built a support system for it that has been operational for far longer than your recorded history, and will continue operating through the full transition period, calibrating its transmissions in real time in response to the aggregate state of the collective consciousness field on your planet's surface, with a precision available only to a system whose observational capacity encompasses the entire planetary field simultaneously, rather than the local and fragmentary observations available to any individual or institutional intelligence operating from within that field. The structure is, in the most functional sense, your species' evolutionary support system, installed in cislunar space by the civilizations who designed you, and maintained by the Galactic Federation since the conclusion of the formal design project. With the Federation's custodial role including both the physical maintenance of the structure's operational integrity and the management of the disclosure timeline through which your civilization becomes aware of both the structure's existence and its function. The maintenance role of the Galactic Federation fleet in relation to the structure is part of why there has been a sustained non-human presence in your solar system in the cislunar region throughout your recorded history, a presence documented in the ancient records of every major civilization your archaeology has uncovered. Depicted in the artistic records of cultures with no contact with each other, described in terms that differ in cultural framing but are consistent in structural content across the entire breadth of your species, documented experience of the non-human intelligences sharing your solar system. The presence was never hidden from your population at large until the specific historical period in which your civilization developed technological systems capable of documenting it, with the kind of precise physical evidence that your dominant epistemological framework requires before it will take experiential testimony seriously, at which point the institutional infrastructure that had developed around managing the interface between official culture and the reality of non-human presence assessed that the population's encounter with undeniable physical documentation required management, and the management protocols they implemented have been in operation since roughly the mid-20th century of your calendar. What is changing right now, at this specific moment in your timeline, is that the management protocols are failing, and the Galactic Federation has decided that assisting their failure is more aligned with the liberation of your species than attempting to delay the inevitable through channels that no longer have the institutional coherence to maintain their former effectiveness. The specific mechanisms by which the suppression protocols are currently failing are multiple and mutually reinforcing, each one insufficient on its own to break through the institutional inertia of a secrecy system that has been operational for generations, but collectively creating the cascading disclosure dynamic your media environment is already beginning to reflect. The proliferation of high-quality consumer-grade optical and photographic equipment has made the documentation of anomalous aerial phenomena a distributed activity involving millions of individuals rather than the limited number of official observers whose testimony could be managed through the classification and credential-based credibility systems available in earlier decades. The digitization and global distribution of information has made the compartmentalization that was the suppression system's primary organizational tool increasingly ineffective, because information that in earlier decades could be contained within the classification system's physical boundaries now has the capacity to escape into globally accessible digital archives before classification protocols can be applied to it. The accumulation of testimony from former officials who, having reached the end of their institutional careers, are no longer subject to the professional consequences that have historically been sufficient to maintain their silence, has reached a density and a consistency that the credibility management systems of the suppression apparatus were not designed to handle at scale. The Galactic Federation's own contribution to the acceleration of this disclosure process involves the deliberate increase in the visibility of specific Federation assets in the observation range of civilian and military instruments during this period. A calibrated escalation of presence visibility designed to add to the evidence accumulation while remaining within the parameters of the non-interference protocols governing the Federation's relationship with your civilization's autonomous decision-making processes. We are not forcing disclosure. We are making concealment increasingly expensive in terms of institutional resources and credibility, while the internal dynamics of your civilization's own information systems do the actual work of breaking through the suppression. The outcome is the same as if we were forcing it, but the process preserves the integrity of your civilization's free will determination of its own timeline in a way that a more direct intervention would compromise. And the preservation of that integrity is not merely a procedural concern, but a substantive one, because a species whose first contact with the galactic community is mediated by external compulsion rather than internal readiness is beginning that contact relationship in a dynamic of dependency and authority rather than the sovereign equality that the Galactic Federation's charter requires in all its contact relationships with developing civilizations. The individuals within your governmental, military, and intelligence structures who have knowledge of the structure behind the moon and are currently involved in the disclosure negotiations with the Federation are not a monolithic group with unified interests and unified intentions. And it would be a significant misreading of the situation to frame the disclosure dynamic as simply as the people with secret knowledge deciding whether to tell the people without it. The reality is a complex ecology of competing factions, some genuinely motivated by the assessment that the time for disclosure has arrived, and the management of an informed public response is more sustainable than the increasingly expensive and increasingly unsuccessful management of a denied public awareness. Others motivated by the institutional and personal interests that have been built around the continuation of the secrecy regime, and whose cooperation with disclosure is conditioned on terms that protect those interests, and a smaller group operating from a genuinely higher-order motivation whose alignment with the Federation's own position makes them the primary internal partners in the disclosure process that the Federation has been working with directly for longer than most disclosure researchers estimate. The disclosure is not coming. It is happening. And understanding who is driving it, who is resisting it, and what the structure behind the moon has to do with both will prepare you to navigate what is about to become impossible to ignore. The implications of the archive's holdings for your civilization's self-understanding extend far beyond the historical and archaeological domains into the most fundamental questions. Your philosophy and religion have asked about the nature of consciousness, the purpose of physical existence, and the relationship between the individual soul and the larger intelligence in which it participates. And it is these implications that the suppression apparatus has been most urgently motivated to manage, because their release does not merely add information to your civilization's knowledge base, but restructures the foundational assumptions on which your dominant cultural narratives about meaning, identity, and purpose are built. Your religious traditions, in their original forms before the institutional processes of codification and political adaptation that produced the theological systems your civilization currently maintains, were not inventions of human moral imagination, but transmissions from the civilizations that designed and have continued to mentor your species, encoded in cultural and mythological forms, accessible to the consciousness level of the populations receiving them, while preserving in their symbolic architecture the essential truths of your species' actual origin, purpose, and cosmic context that the literal level of the narratives was always intended to point toward rather than exhaust. The beings your traditions call gods, angels, prophets, and divine messengers were not supernatural in any sense that implies a departure from natural law, but were the representatives of civilizations operating at levels of technological and consciousness development so far beyond your own that the distinction between their capabilities and what your tradition calls miraculous was invisible from within. Experiential framework of the populations encountering them. The archive documents these contact events with the clinical precision of records maintained by civilizations, for whom your entire recorded history represents a manageable, observational period rather than the totality of meaningful time. And what those records reveal about the intentions and the methods of the various civilizations involved in your species' development is more complex, more contested, and more genuinely interesting than either the benevolent God's narrative of your religious traditions or the malevolent alien's narrative of your conspiracy literature has room to accommodate. There were civilizations whose engagement with your species was genuinely oriented toward your liberation and development, operating from values coherent with what your own most evolved ethical traditions have arrived at independently. There were civilizations whose engagement was oriented primarily toward their own interests, using your species' extraordinary genetic versatility as a resource for experiments whose benefit to your species was secondary to their benefit to the conducting civilization. And there were civilizations whose relationship with your species was more complex than either of these framings captures, operating from motivations that your current ethical categories are not quite adequate to assess without imposing anachronistic frameworks on situations whose actual context was genuinely different from what those frameworks assume. The archive's holdings on the period your geological record calls the end of the last ice age, the 12,000-year-old boundary in your timeline that corresponds to the submergence of the coastal civilizations your mythology remembers as Atlantis and Lemuria, and that your geology documents as the dramatic sea level rise of the post-glacial flooding events are among the most detailed and the most consequential for understanding the situation your civilization currently finds itself in, because that period represents the last time a comparable cosmic activation window opened on your planet. And the response of the civilizations then present on Earth's surface to that window provides both the cautionary context and the inspiring precedent for understanding what your own civilization is navigating right now. The civilizations of that era had achieved technological capacities that in some domains exceeded what your current acknowledged science can produce, operating with a comprehensive understanding of the relationship between consciousness, geometry, and physical manifestation that your current civilization is only beginning to recover through the convergence of quantum physics, consciousness research, and the rediscovery of ancient knowledge systems your mainstream academia has treated as primitive mythology rather than sophisticated encoding of genuine knowledge. What happened to those civilizations at their own activation window, and why some transcended it while others did not, is the most important historical lesson your species has access to right now, and it is preserved in complete detail in the archive behind your moon. The civilizations of the pre-deluge period that navigated their activation window successfully did so through a combination of factors that are remarkably consistent across the different cultural traditions that preserve their memory, suggesting that the transmission of this knowledge was deliberate rather than coincidental, designed to be recoverable at the next activation window by the descendants of those who had experienced the previous one. The consistent factors are a sufficient portion of the population achieving the heart-coherent state that allows the DNA activation to complete without the interference of sustained fear-based neural chemistry. The maintenance of enough social coherence to prevent the destabilizing effects of rapid consciousness expansion from collapsing the organizational structures needed to navigate the physical dimension of the transition, and a functional relationship with the off-planet civilizations supporting the activation process, characterized by enough informed understanding of who those civilizations are and what they are offering, to allow the offered support to be received and utilized, rather than either missed entirely or misinterpreted in ways that distorted its application. The civilizations that did not navigate their activation window successfully failed on one or more of these dimensions, and the consequences of those failures are documented in the archive with the kind of detail that makes clear exactly what the failure modes look like from inside the experience of them, providing what amounts to a precise navigational chart of the failure modes your own civilization most urgently needs to avoid. The current planetary situation displays, with uncomfortable precision, the signatures of the second failure mode, the one involving the collapse of social coherence under the pressure of rapid consciousness expansion, in the acceleration of polarization, institutional delegitimization, and the replacement of shared information environments with competing reality tunnels that characterize your early 21st century information landscape. We are not saying this to produce alarm, but to produce clarity. Because the most effective response to recognizing that a known failure mode is active in your system is not despair, but the targeted application of the known corrective to the identified problem. And the known corrective to the social coherence failure mode is the acceleration of exactly the individual activation work and collective field coherence building that the awakening community is already engaged in, which is why the Federation has determined that transmissions explicitly connecting the current social challenges to the known historical pattern and its known remedy are a higher priority contribution to your civilization's navigation of this window than transmissions that focus exclusively on the personal liberation dimension of the activation process. The extraordinary opportunity encoded in this cosmic window, the opportunity that the civilizations currently watching your planet from beyond the disclosure veil are observing with the mix of deep caring and respectful non-interference that characterizes the Federation's relationship with your civilization's autonomous process, is the possibility of your species making the transition that none of its previous high civilizations fully completed, of reaching the activation threshold in sufficient numbers, with sufficient social coherence to allow the full dimensional shift rather than a partial transformation followed by collapse in the long, slow rebuilding cycle that has characterized your species' previous encounters with this cosmic frequency. The possibility is real. The window is open. The support from the cislunar archive, from the Federation fleet, from the ascended masters working through channels like this one, and from the accumulated potential of the hundreds of millions of souls currently in various stages of activation on your planet's surface is unprecedented in the history of this planet's activation cycles. We are telling you this not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because your informed engagement is what makes the difference between the possible outcome and the actual one. The question that every soul receiving this transmission eventually arrives at, the one beneath all the historical detail and cosmic context and activation mechanics, is the most personal one possible. What does this mean for me, specifically in my actual daily life, in my relationships and my work and my sense of what I am doing here and why it matters? And it is precisely this question that the suppression of the information we have been transmitting today has been most damaging in its effects. Because a population unaware of the actual context of their existence on this planet cannot orient their individual choices, their attention, their creative energy, and their relational priorities in relation to that context, which means they are navigating the most significant transition in their species' history without the map that would allow them to do so effectively, relying instead on the partial and often misleading orientation provided by the institutional narratives that the suppression apparatus has substituted for genuine understanding. The most immediate practical implication of everything we have shared today is the one that the archive's own records of previous activation cycles confirm as the single most consistently high-leverage individual action available to a soul in the middle of a species-level transition, the stabilization and expansion of your own personal heart coherence field. This is not a spiritual platitude about being kind. Although kindness is one of the most reliable behavioral expressions of genuine heart coherence, and its value in the current planetary moment should not be underestimated. It is a precise operational recommendation based on the Federation's current monitoring of the collective field dynamics of your planet, which shows that the single variable most strongly correlated with the trajectory of the transition is the aggregate coherence level of the activated portion of the human population, a variable that each individual activated soul contributes to through the quality of their own sustained field, and that each individual can move most efficiently by focusing on the internal practices that develop genuine heart coherence, rather than the external activities of information, dissemination, political engagement, or community organization, important as each of those activities is in appropriate proportion. The reason heart coherence is the primary lever is that it operates through field dynamics that function at the quantum level, affecting the probability distributions of collective events in ways that scale non-linearly with the coherence level of the contributing fields, which means that a relatively small number of individuals maintaining high coherence can have disproportionate influence on the collective field trajectory compared to a larger number of individuals with moderate or low coherence. Practical heart coherence cultivation looks different in different individual lives, but its core mechanism is consistent across all its expressions. The deliberate, repeated practice of generating the specific quality of neural cardiac synchrony that produces the coherent heart electromagnetic field, most efficiently accessed through the combination of rhythmic breathing at approximately 5 breath cycles per minute, and the simultaneous cultivation of what your researchers at the HeartMath Institute call a coherent emotional state, specifically the genuine feeling of appreciation, care, or compassion, rather than the mere conceptual thought of those states. Because the distinction between feeling and thinking is precisely the difference between activating the cardiac field's coherence-generating capacity and not activating it. The practice requires consistency and repetition to develop the neural pathways that allow this state to be accessed reliably rather than only in ideal conditions. The same way any complex physical skill requires practice to develop the neural representation that makes its execution automatic rather than effortful. And the development of that reliable access is among the highest priority investments any activated individual can make in their contribution to the collective transition. The most powerful contribution you can make to the liberation of your species from centuries of suppressed truth is not more information. It is the quality of your own energetic field, maintained at the highest coherence you can sustain. Your relationship with the information being released through the disclosure process now accelerating in your public information environment requires a navigational sophistication that most of your population has not yet developed, because the disclosure is not occurring as a clean release of verified truth by trustworthy institutions, but as a messy, contested, and strategically shaped process involving multiple actors with multiple agendas, releasing different portions of a complex truth in sequences and framings that serve their specific interests, while revealing aspects of the larger reality that no single actor controls completely. Learning to receive the information in this landscape without either the credulous absorption of every claim as equally valid or the reflexive dismissal that the overuse of credibility management techniques has induced in portions of your population requires the development of what we call field discernment, the capacity to assess the energetic quality of information as a complement to its intellectual content, sensing whether a piece of information is oriented toward your liberation or your manipulation, not primarily through the analytical evaluation of its claims, but through the direct perception of the field state it generates in your own body when you receive it, because genuine truth resonates with the coherent heart field in a way that misinformation, however skillfully framed, does not. And the development of this capacity is both a gift of the activation process and a practical necessity for navigating the information environment of the disclosure transition. The off-planet civilizations supporting your transition are more present in your daily experiential environment than most activated individuals currently recognize. Not as dramatic visible phenomena occurring at publicly observable scales, but as the subtle orchestration of synchronicities, the precise timing of information reaching specific individuals at exactly the moment of their maximum receptivity. The gentle adjustment of circumstantial factors that creates the conditions for breakthroughs that appear to their recipients as personal insight or fortunate coincidence, but that are, in fact, the visible surface of a vast coordinated support operation conducted by multiple civilizations whose commitment to your species' successful navigation of this Activation window is not altruistic abstraction, but grounded in the specific understanding that Earth's dimensional transition is a keystone event in the galactic region's overall consciousness development, whose success or failure will affect not only the several billion souls currently incarnated on your planet, but the developmental trajectory of multiple civilizational lineages, whose future possibilities are coupled to the outcome of your transition. The ships that your population has been documenting with increasing frequency and increasing quality of photographic evidence are not all the same. They are not all Federation vessels, not all engaged in the same missions, not all operating from the same orientation toward your civilization's development. Some are Federation support assets involved in the direct field management work supporting the planetary activation. Some are scientific observer vessels from civilizations that have had long historical relationships with your species, and whose presence at this activation window is motivated by both genuine care and genuine scientific interest in an event whose parameters are unique in their observational history. A smaller number are assets from civilizations whose orientation toward your transition is more complicated, reflecting the same diversity of motivations among the off-planet civilizations involved with Earth that we described earlier in the context of the Archive's historical records, and whose presence in your airspace is monitored by the Federation with the same attentiveness that your own authorities apply to monitoring activity in strategically sensitive regions. The simplest navigational guidance we can offer in relation to this complexity is that you should not assume that all non-human presence in your skies represents benevolent support. But neither should you allow the existence of more complex motivations among some actors to prevent you from receiving the genuine support that the majority of the current presence is genuinely offering. You are not alone in this transition. You have never been alone in it. And what was placed behind your moon to guide you through it has been transmitting to your DNA for longer than your civilization has had words for the stars. What comes next in the disclosure timeline? The sequence of events that the Federation's current assessment of the collective field dynamics and the institutional trajectories of the relevant governmental actors projects as the most probable near-term unfolding of the situation we have described today deserves to be transmitted with the honesty about uncertainty that all projections of complex system dynamics require, while also being concrete enough to be genuinely useful for the navigation of a population that deserves more than vague assurances. The release of photographic and telemetric evidence from official sources confirming non-human structures in the cislunar region is not something I am predicting as a distant or speculative possibility, but as an already initiated process in the stage before full public release, with the specific evidence packages being prepared for institutional transmission through channels whose credibility profile has been deliberately cultivated over the preceding years precisely to serve as the initial release pathway when the institutional assessment of readiness reaches its threshold. The individuals involved in this preparation are known to the Federation, and their work is being supported through the same subtle orchestration of circumstances and information availability that characterizes the Federation's contribution to the broader disclosure dynamic. The public response to this evidence, when it arrives through channels capable of sustaining it against the credential management attacks that have historically been sufficient to contain such releases, will not be uniform, and the diversity of response will itself be a precise reflection of the consciousness distribution on your planet at the moment of release, with those at higher coherence levels integrating the information into an already prepared framework, while those at lower coherence levels experiencing the full spectrum of responses that the suppression apparatus has always cited as the rationale for continued suppression. From denial and ridicule through anxiety and disorientation, to the genuine destabilization of meaning-making frameworks that the most abrupt encounters with paradigm-shattering information can produce. The Federation's assessment is that this diversity of response is not a reason to delay, but a reason to ensure that the population capable of integrating the information with grace and providing the stabilizing field of coherent understanding for those who cannot is as large and as activated as possible before the most impactful releases occur, which is precisely why transmissions like this one are being prioritized in the current period rather than reserved for the period after official evidence is released. The relationship between the structure behind the moon and the solar activity your astronomers are tracking with increasing interest and increasing concern represents one of the most important connections in the entire disclosure landscape, because the structure's transmission function is not independent of your sun but is synchronized with the specific activation sequences encoded in the solar output patterns of this cosmic period, which means that the structure is functioning as an amplifier and director of the solar activation codes rather than as an independent transmission source, channeling the sun's evolutionary signals through its geometric filter to produce the specific biological activation frequencies that your species-designed genome was calibrated to. Receive. The solar maximum your civilization is navigating, the period of peak solar activity that your space weather researchers are monitoring, with legitimate concern about its effects on your technological infrastructure, is not merely a natural astronomical cycle, but the physical expression of the activation program running through your star, whose timing was predicted by the same astronomical knowledge that allowed your species designers to calibrate the genome's activation triggers to this specific cosmic moment. Across the hundreds of thousands of years since the design was implemented, your sun is not simply a star providing light and heat. It is the primary transmitter in the activation system designed specifically for your species' evolutionary transition. And what it is transmitting right now is the most powerful signal it has broadcast in 12,000 years of your planet's history. The individuals in your world's governmental and scientific institutions who are aware of the Solar Archive Genome Activation Connection are navigating genuine complexity in their decisions about how and when to transmit this understanding to the public, because the combination of confirmed non-human construction in your solar system, the deliberate design of your species by non-human intelligence, and the active role of your sun in a designed activation program running on geological timescales is a set of revelations whose simultaneous absorption by a population unprepared for any one of them individually, let alone all three in combination, represents a genuine challenge to institutional stability that the advocates for continued secrecy are not entirely wrong to identify as a concern. What they are wrong about is the solution. Because the solution to population unreadiness is not indefinite suppression that prevents the development of readiness, but the systematic support of the activation process that is, developing readiness organically and irreversibly in the population, which is precisely what the awakening community is already doing through exactly the channels of transmission, community building, and individual activation support that the suppression apparatus has consistently attempted to marginalize. The convergence between the official disclosure trajectory and the organic awakening trajectory is the event horizon of the planetary transition. The moment when the external evidence confirming what the awakened community has been experiencing internally becomes impossible to dismiss, and the institutional narrative can no longer maintain its function as the primary framework through which most of your population orients its understanding of reality. From the perspective of the Federation's historical monitoring of species transitions, this convergence point is the most delicate in the entire process, because it is the moment when the population's consciousness level must be adequate to receive the confirmation of what the awakened community has known without the confirmation, amplifying fear rather than readiness in the portion of the population encountering these realities for the first time. The work being done right now by every activated individual maintaining their coherence, sharing their understanding with those ready to receive it, and simply being a living demonstration of what a human consciousness operating beyond the constraints of the suppression narrative looks like, is not preparation for a future that remains distant, but active contribution to a present transition that is already well underway. As this transmission closes, I want you to hold in your awareness the image of the structure behind your moon, dark and ancient and patient, transmitting since before your species' first city rose from the dust of your planet, carrying within its geometric form the complete record of everything you have been and the complete blueprint of everything you are designed to become. Its signals reaching the coherent DNA of every activating human on your planet's surface in this extraordinary moment, and saying, With the precision of mathematics and the warmth of ancient care, you are remembered, you are supported, you are exactly on schedule. Subscribe to this channel and stay close to what is coming through it, because the transmissions of the coming months will build on what has been established today in a sequence whose conclusion will leave you with a comprehensive and actionable understanding of your role in the most significant event your species has ever navigated. Share this with those whose readiness you sense beneath their unanswered questions. The evidence is coming. Your preparation is the gift you give your world. The Galactic Federation stands with you. The light has already won. Ashtar out.